Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. This book consists of 92 pages containing the editor's introduction and 8 chapters. The following material appears on the cover of the book. Civilization and Its Discontents is one of the last of Freud's books, written in the decade before his death. In it, he makes known his views on the broad question of man's place in the world, which he sees in terms of the never-ending conflict between the individual's claim to freedom and the demands of society. The theme, often foreshadowed in Freud's earlier work, is that civilization is only made possible by individual renouncement. Man's instinctive life is aggressive and egoistic, seeking self-satisfaction. The structure of culture is designed to curb and prohibit his instinctual drives. The sense of guilt has become the maker of civilized humanity. The theme is developed with the greatest richness of content, and one might use many columns without exhausting the invaluable dicta of men and their institutions which strew the book. The Spectator. The Standard Edition. Throughout the period when Freud wrote his major works, various translations and editions, differing widely in the accuracy of their texts and the quality of their content, made their appearance. Increasingly, as the body of Freud's work achieved commanding stature, the need arose for a definitive and uniformly authentic English-language edition of all his writings. The standard edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud was undertaken to achieve this goal. The work is under the general editorship of James Strachey, and he himself has made new translations of many of the writings, supervising the emendation of others and contributing valuable notes, both bibliographical and explanatory. The result is to place this edition in a position of unquestioned supremacy over all other existing versions, which are, in fact, rendered obsolete. Editor's Introduction. Das Unbehagen in der Kultur. The present translation is based on the edition published in 1930. The first chapter of the German original was published slightly in advance of the rest of the book in Psychoanalytische Bewegung, November-December 1929. The fifth chapter appeared separately in the next issue of the same periodical, January-February 1930. 2 or 3 extra footnotes were included in the edition of 1931, and a new final sentence was added to the work. None of these editions appeared in the earlier version of the English translation. Freud had finished The Future of an Illusion in the autumn of 1927. During the following 2 years, chiefly, no doubt, on account of his illness, he produced very little. But in the summer of 1929, he began writing another book, once more on a sociological subject. The first draft was finished by the end of July. The book was sent to the printers early in November and was actually published before the end of the year, though it carried the date 1930 on its title page. The original title chosen for it by Freud was Das Unglück in der Kultur, Unhappiness in Civilization, but Unglück was later altered to Unbehagen, a word for which it was difficult to choose an English equivalent, though the French malaise might have served. Freud suggested man's discomfort in civilization in a letter to his translator, Mrs. Riviere. But it was she herself who found the ideal solution of the difficulty in the title that was finally adopted. The main theme of the book, the irremediable antagonism between the demands of instinct and the restrictions of civilization, may be traced back to some of Freud's very earliest psychological writings. Thus, on May 31st, 1897, he wrote to Fliess that incest is antisocial, and civilization consists in a progressive renunciation of it. And a year later, in a paper on sexuality in the etiology of the neuroses, he wrote that we may justly hold our civilization responsible for the spread of neurasthenia. Nevertheless, in his early writings, Freud does not seem to have regarded repression as being wholly due to external social influences. Though in his 3 essays he spoke of the inverse relation holding between civilization and the free development of sexuality, elsewhere in the same work he had the following comment to make on the dams against the sexual instinct that emerged during the latency period. One gets an impression from civilized children that the construction of these dams is a product of education, and no doubt education has much to do with it. But in reality, this development is organically determined and fixed by heredity, and it can occasionally occur without any help at all from education. The notion of there being an organic repression paving the way to civilization, a notion that is expanded in the 2 long footnotes at the beginning and end of Chapter 4, goes back to the same early period. In a letter to Fliess of November 14, 1897, Freud wrote that he had often suspected that something organic played a part in repression. He went on, in precisely the sense of these footnotes, to suggest the importance as factors in repression of the adoption of an upright carriage and the replacement of smell by sight as the dominant sense. A still earlier hint at the same idea occurs in a letter of January 11, 1897. In Freud's published writings, the only mentions of these ideas before the present one seem to be a short passage in the Rat-Man analysis, and a still shorter one in the second paper on the psychology of love. In particular, no analysis of the deeper internal origins of civilization is to be found in what is by far the longest of Freud's earlier discussions of the subject, his paper on civilized sexual morality and modern nervous illness, which gives the impression of the restrictions of civilization as something imposed from without. But indeed, no clear evaluation of the part played in these restrictions by internal and external influences and of their reciprocal effects was possible till Freud's investigations of ego psychology had led him to his hypotheses of the superego and its origin from the individual's earliest object relations. It is because of this that such a large part of the present work, especially in chapters 7 and 8, is concerned with the further exploration and clarification of the nature of the sense of guilt, and that Freud declares his intention to represent the sense of guilt as the most important problem in the development of civilization. And this, in turn, is the ground for the second major side issue of this work, though neither of them is in fact a side issue, the destructive instinct. The history of Freud's views on the aggressive or destructive instinct is a complicated one and can only be summarily indicated here. Throughout his earlier writings, the context in which he viewed it predominantly was that of sadism. His first lengthy discussions of this were in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, where it appeared as one of the component instincts of the sexual instinct. Thus, he wrote in section 2b of the first essay, sadism would correspond to an aggressive component of the sexual instinct which has become independent and exaggerated, and, by displacement, has usurped the leading position. Nevertheless, later on, in section 4 of the second essay, the original independence of the aggressive impulses was recognized. It may be assumed that the impulses of cruelty arise from sources which are in fact independent of sexuality, but may become united with it at an early stage. The independent sources indicated were to be traced to the self-preservative instincts. This passage was altered in the edition of 1915, where it was stated that the impulse of cruelty arises from the instinct for mastery, and the phrase about its being independent of sexuality was omitted. But already in 1909, in the course of combating Adler's theories, Freud had made a much more sweeping pronouncement. In Section 2 of the third chapter of the Little Hans case history, Freud wrote, "I cannot bring myself to assume the existence of a special aggressive instinct alongside of the familiar instincts of self-preservation and of sex, and on an equal footing with them. The reluctance to accept an aggressive instinct independent of the libido was assisted by the hypothesis of narcissism. Impulses of aggressiveness, and of hatred too, had from the first seemed to belong to the self-preservative instinct, and, since this was now subsumed under the libido, no independent aggressive instinct was called for. And this was so in spite of the bipolarity of object relations, of the frequent admixtures of love and hate, and of the complex origin of hate itself. It was not until Freud's hypothesis of a death instinct that a truly independent aggressive instinct came into view in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But it is to be remarked that even there, in Freud's later writings, for instance, in Chapter 4 of The Ego and the Id, the aggressive instinct was still something secondary, derived from the primary self-destructive death instinct. This is still true of the present work, even though here the stress is much more upon the death instinct's manifestations outwards. And it is also true of the further discussions of the problem in the later part of Lecture 32 of the new introductory lectures, and at more than one point in the posthumously published Outline of Psychoanalysis. It is nevertheless tempting to quote a couple of sentences from a letter written by Freud on May 27, 1937, to Princess Marie Bonaparte, in which he appears to be hinting at a greater original independence of external destructiveness. The turning inwards of the aggressive instinct is of course the counterpart to the turning outwards of the libido when it passes over from the ego to objects. We should have a neat schematic picture if we supposed that originally, at the beginning of life, all libido was directed to the inside and all aggressiveness to the outside, and that in the course of life this gradually altered. But perhaps this may not be correct. It is only fair to add that in his next letter Freud wrote, "I beg you not to set too much value on my remarks about the destructive instinct. They were only made at random, and would have to be carefully thought over before being published. Moreover, there is little that is new in them. It will thus be obvious that Civilization and its Discontents is a work whose interest ranges far beyond sociology." Chapter 1. It is impossible to escape the impression that people commonly use false standards of measurement, that they seek power, success, and wealth for themselves, and admire them in others, and that they underestimate what is of true value in life. And yet, in making any general judgment of this sort, we are in danger of forgetting how variegated the human world and its mental life are. There are a few men from whom their contemporaries do not withhold admiration, although their greatness rests on attributes and achievements which are completely foreign to the aims and ideals of the multitude. One might easily be inclined to suppose that it is, after all, only a minority which appreciates these great men, while the large majority cares nothing for them. But things are probably not as simple as that, thanks to the discrepancies between people's thoughts and their actions, and to the diversity of their wishful impulses. One of these exceptional few calls himself my friend in his letters to me. I had sent him my small book that treats religion as an illusion, the future of an illusion, and he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgment upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling, which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into particular channels, and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even if one rejects every belief and every illusion. The views expressed by the friend whom I so much honor, and who himself once praised the magic of illusion in a poem, caused me no small difficulty. I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It is not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One can attempt to describe their physiological signs. Where this is not possible, and I am afraid that the oceanic feeling, too, will defy this kind of characterization, nothing remains but to fall back on the ideational content which is most readily associated with the feeling. If I have understood my friend rightly, he means the same thing by it as the consolation offered by an original and somewhat eccentric dramatist to his hero who is facing a self-inflicted death. We cannot fall out of this world. That is to say, it is a feeling of an indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. I may remark that to me this seems something rather in the nature of an intellectual perception, which is not, it is true, without an accompanying feeling tone, but only such as would be present with any other act of thought of equal range. From my own experience, I could not convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. But this gives me no right to deny that it does in fact occur in other people. The only question is whether it is being correctly interpreted, and whether it ought to be regarded as the fons et origo of the whole need for religion. I have nothing to suggest which could have a decisive influence on the solution of this problem. The idea of men's receiving an intimation of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling which is from the outset directed to that purpose sounds so strange and fits in so badly with the fabric of our psychology that one is justified in attempting to discover a psychoanalytic, that is, a genetic, explanation of such a feeling. The following line of thought suggests itself. Normally, there is nothing of which we are more certain than the feeling of ourself, of our own ego. This ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary, marked off distinctly from everything else. That such an appearance is deceptive, and that, on the contrary, the ego is continued inwards without any sharp delimitation into an unconscious mental entity which we designate as the id, and for which it serves as a kind of facade. This was a discovery first made by psychoanalytic research, which should still have much more to tell us about the relation of the ego to the id. But towards the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. There is only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. What can be temporarily done away with by a physiological, that is, normal function, must also, of course, be liable to be disturbed by pathological processes. Pathology has made us acquainted with a great number of states in which the boundary lines between the ego and the external world become uncertain, or in which they are actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases in which parts of a person's own body even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego and that ought to be acknowledged by it. Thus, even the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and the boundaries of the ego are not constant. Further reflection tells us that the adult's ego feeling cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have gone through a process of development, which cannot, of course, be demonstrated, but which admits of being constructed with a fair degree of probability. An infant at the breast does not as yet distinguish his ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in upon him. He gradually learns to do so in response to various promptings. He must be very strongly impressed by the fact that some sources of excitation, which he will later recognize as his own bodily organs, can provide him with sensations at any moment, whereas other sources evade him from time to time. Among them, what he desires most of all, his mother's breast, and only reappear as a result of his screaming for help. In this way, there is, for the first time, set over against the ego an object in the form of something which exists outside and which is only forced to appear by a special action. A further incentive to a disengagement of the ego from the general mass of sensations, that is, to the recognition of an outside, an external world, is provided by the frequent, manifold, and unavoidable sensations of pain and unpleasure, the removal and avoidance of which is enjoined by the pleasure principle, in the exercise of its unrestricted domination. A tendency arises to separate from the ego everything that can become a source of such unpleasure, to throw it outside, and to create a pure pleasure ego which is confronted by a strange and threatening outside. The boundaries of this primitive pleasure ego cannot escape rectification through experience. Some of the things that one is unwilling to give up because they give pleasure are nevertheless not ego but object, and some sufferings that one seeks to expel turn out to be inseparable from the ego in virtue of their internal origin. One comes to learn a procedure by which, through a deliberate direction of one's sensory activities and through suitable muscular action, one can differentiate between what is internal, what belongs to the ego, and what is external, what emanates from the outer world. In this way, one makes the first step towards the introduction of the reality principle, which is to dominate future development. This differentiation, of course, serves the practical purpose of enabling one to defend oneself against sensations of unpleasure which one actually feels or with which one is threatened. In order to fend off certain unpleasurable excitations arising from within, the ego can use no other methods than those which it uses against unpleasure coming from without, and this is the starting point of important pathological disturbances. In this way, then, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or, to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or less degree, it would exist in them side by side with a narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe, the same ideas with which my friend elucidated the oceanic feeling. But have we a right to assume the survival of something that was originally there alongside of what was later derived from it? Undoubtedly. There is nothing strange in such a phenomenon, whether in the mental field or elsewhere. In the animal kingdom, we hold to the view that the most highly developed species have proceeded from the lowest, and yet we find all the simple forms still in existence today. The race of the great saurians is extinct and has made way for the mammals, but a true representative of it, the crocodile, still lives among us. This analogy may be too remote, and it is also weakened by the circumstance that the lower species which survive are, for the most part, not the true ancestors of the present-day more highly developed species. As a rule, the intermediate links have died out and are known to us only through reconstruction. In the realm of the mind, on the other hand, what is primitive is so commonly preserved alongside of the transformed version which has arisen from it that it is unnecessary to give instances as evidence. When this happens, it is usually in consequence of a divergence in development. One portion, in the quantitative sense, of an attitude or instinctual impulse has remained unaltered, while another portion has undergone further development. This brings us to the more general problem of preservation in the sphere of the mind. The subject has hardly been studied as yet, but it is so attractive and important that we may be allowed to turn our attention to it for a little, even though our excuse is insufficient. Since we overcame the error of supposing that the forgetting we are familiar with signified a destruction of the memory trace, that is, its annihilation, we have been inclined to take the opposite view, that in mental life nothing which has once been formed can perish, that everything is somehow preserved, and that in suitable circumstances, when, for instance, regression goes back far enough, it can once more be brought to light. Let us try to grasp what this assumption involves by taking an analogy from another field. We will choose as an example the history of the Eternal City. Historians tell us that the oldest Rome was the Roma Quadrata, a fenced settlement on the Palatine. Then followed the phase of the Septimontium, a federation of the settlements on the different hills. After that came the city bounded by the Servian Wall, and later still, after all the transformations during the periods of the Republic and the early Caesars, the city which the Emperor Aurelian surrounded with his walls. We will not follow the changes which the city went through any further, but we will ask ourselves how much a visitor, whom we will suppose to be equipped with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge, may still find left of these early stages in the Rome of today. We will not follow the changes which the city went through any further, but we will ask ourselves how much a visitor, whom we will suppose to be equipped with the most complete historical and topographical knowledge, may still find left of these early stages in the Rome of today. Except for a few gaps, he will see the wall of Aurelian almost unchanged. In some places he will be able to find sections of the Servian wall where they have been excavated and brought to light. If he knows enough, more than present-day archaeology does, he may perhaps be able to trace out in the plan of the city the whole course of that wall and the outline of the Roma Quadrata. Of the buildings which once occupied this ancient area he will find nothing, or only scanty remains, for they exist no longer. The best information about Rome in the Republican era would only enable him at the most to point out the sites where the temples and public buildings of that period stood. Their place is now taken by ruins, but not by ruins of themselves, but of later restorations made after fires or destruction. It is hardly necessary to remark that all these remains of ancient Rome are found dovetailed into the jumble of a great metropolis which has grown up in the last few centuries since the Renaissance. There is certainly not a little that is ancient still buried in the soil of the city or beneath its modern buildings. This is the manner in which the past is preserved in historical sites like Rome. Now let us, by a flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. This would mean that in Rome the palaces of the Caesars and the Septizonium of Septimius Severus would still be rising to their old height on the Palatine, and that the castle of St. Angelo would still be carrying on its battlements the beautiful statues which graced it until the siege by the Goths, and so on. But more than this. In the place occupied by the Palazzo Caffarelli would once more stand, without the palazzo having to be removed, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. And this not only in its latest shape, as the Romans of the Empire saw it, but also in its earliest one, when it still showed Etruscan forms and was ornamented with terracotta antefixes. Where the Colosseum now stands, we could at the same time admire Nero's vanished golden house. On the piazza of the Pantheon, we should find not only the Pantheon of today, as it was bequeathed to us by Hadrian, but on the same site the original edifice erected by Agrippa. Indeed, the same piece of ground would be supporting the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and the ancient temple over which it was built. And the observer would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position in order to call up the one view or the other. There is clearly no point in spinning our fantasy any further, for it leads to things that are unimaginable and even absurd. If we want to represent historical sequence in spatial terms, we can only do it by juxtaposition in space. The same space cannot have two different contents. Our attempt seems to be an idle game. It has only one justification. It shows us how far we are from mastering the characteristics of mental life by representing them in pictorial terms. There is one further objection which has to be considered. The question may be raised why we chose precisely the past of a city to compare with the past of the mind. The assumption that everything past is preserved holds good even in mental life only on condition that the organ of the mind has remained intact and that its tissues have not been damaged by trauma or inflammation. But destructive influences which can be compared to causes of illness like these are never lacking in the history of a city, even if it has had a less checkered past than Rome, and even if, like London, it has hardly ever suffered from the visitations of an enemy. Demolitions and replacement of buildings occur in the course of the most peaceful development of a city. A city is thus a priori unsuited for a comparison of this sort with a mental organism. We bow to this objection, and, abandoning our attempt to draw a striking contrast, we will turn instead to what is after all a more closely related object of comparison, the body of an animal or a human being. But here, too, we find the same thing. The earlier phases of development are in no sense still preserved. They have been absorbed into the later phases for which they have supplied the material. The embryo cannot be discovered in the adult. The thymus gland of childhood is replaced after puberty by connective tissue, but is no longer present itself. In the marrow bones of the grown man I can, it is true, trace the outline of the child's bone, but it itself has disappeared, having lengthened and thickened until it has attained its definitive form. The fact remains that only in the mind is such a preservation of all the earlier stages alongside of the final form possible, and that we are not in a position to represent this phenomenon in pictorial terms. Perhaps we are going too far in this. Perhaps we ought to content ourselves with asserting that what is past in mental life may be preserved, and is not necessarily destroyed. It is always possible that even in the mind some of what is old is effaced or absorbed, whether in the normal course of things or as an exception, to such an extent that it cannot be restored or revivified by any means, or that preservation in general is dependent on certain favorable conditions. It is possible, but we know nothing about it. We can only hold fast to the fact that it is rather the rule than the exception for the past to be preserved in mental life. Thus we are perfectly willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are inclined to trace it back to an early phase of ego feeling. The further question then arises, what claim this feeling has to be regarded as the source of religious needs. To me, the claim does not seem compelling. After all, a feeling can only be a source of energy if it is itself the expression of a strong need. The derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me incontrovertible, especially since the feeling is not simply prolonged from childhood days, but is permanently sustained by fear of the superior power of fate. I cannot think of any need in childhood as strong as the need for a father's protection. Thus the part played by the oceanic feeling, which might seek something like the restoration of limitless narcissism, is ousted from a place in the foreground. The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. There may be something further behind that, but for the present it is wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on. The oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, sounds like a first attempt at a religious consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming the danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. Let me admit once more that it is very difficult for me to work with these almost intangible quantities. Another friend of mine, whose insatiable craving for knowledge has led him to make the most unusual experiments, and has ended by giving him encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that through the practices of yoga, by withdrawing from the world, by fixing the attention on bodily functions, and by peculiar methods of breathing, one can in fact evoke new sensations and synesthesias in oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial states of mind which have long ago been overlaid. He sees in them a physiological basis, as it were, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. It would not be hard to find connections here with a number of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies. But I am moved to exclaim in the words of Schiller's diver, "Let him rejoice who breathes up here in the roseate light." Chapter 2. In my Future of an Illusion, I was concerned much less with the deepest sources of the religious feeling than with what the common man understands by his religion, with the system of doctrines and promises which on the one hand explains to him the riddles of this world with enviable completeness, and on the other assures him that a careful providence will watch over his life and will compensate him in a future existence for any frustrations he suffers here. The common man cannot imagine this providence otherwise than in the figure of an enormously exalted Father. Only such a being can understand the needs of the children of men, and be softened by their prayers, and placated by the signs of their remorse. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, It is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. It is still more humiliating to discover how large a number of people living today, who cannot but see that this religion is not tenable, nevertheless try to defend it piece by piece in a series of pitiful rearguard actions. One would like to mix among the ranks of the believers in order to meet these philosophers who think they can rescue the God of religion by replacing him by an impersonal, shadowy, and abstract principle, and to address them with the warning words, "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." And if some of the great men of the past acted in the same way, no appeal can be made to their example. We know why they were obliged to. Let us return to the common man and to his religion, the only religion which ought to bear that name. The first thing that we think of is the well-known saying of one of our great poets and thinkers concerning the relation of religion to art and science. He who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who possesses neither of those two, let him have religion. Goethe. This saying, on the one hand, draws an antithesis between religion and the two highest achievements of man, and on the other, asserts that, as regards their value in life, those achievements and religion can represent or replace each other. If we also set out to deprive the common man, who has neither science nor art, of his religion, we shall clearly not have the poet's authority on our side. We will choose a particular path to bring us nearer an appreciation of his words. Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. We cannot do without auxiliary constructions, as Theodor Fontana tells us. There are perhaps 3 such measures: powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery; substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it; and intoxicating substances, which make us insensitive to it. Something of the kind is indispensable. In Die Fromme Helene, Wilhelm Busch has said the same thing on a lower plane. He who has cares has brandy too. Voltaire has deflections in mind when he ends Candide with the advice to cultivate one's garden, and scientific activity is a deflection of this kind too. The substitutive satisfactions, as offered by art, are illusions in contrast with reality, but they are nonetheless psychically effective, thanks to the role which fantasy has assumed in mental life. The intoxicating substances influence our body and alter its chemistry. It is no simple matter to see where religion has its place in this series. We must look further afield. The question of the purpose of human life has been raised countless times. It has never yet received a satisfactory answer, and perhaps does not admit of one. Some of those who have asked it have added that if it should turn out that life has no purpose, it would lose all value for them. But this threat alters nothing. It looks, on the contrary, as though one had a right to dismiss the question, for it seems to derive from the human presumptuousness, many other manifestations of which are already familiar to us. Nobody talks about the purpose of the life of animals, unless perhaps it may be supposed to lie in being of service to man. But this view is not tenable either, for there are many animals of which man can make nothing, except to describe, classify, and study them. And innumerable species of animals have escaped even this use, since they existed and became extinct before man set eyes on them. Once again, only religion can answer the question of the purpose of life. One can hardly be wrong in concluding that the idea of life having a purpose stands and falls with the religious system. We will therefore turn to the less ambitious question of what men themselves show by their behavior to be the purpose and intention of their lives. What do they demand of life and wish to achieve in it? The answer to this can hardly be in doubt. They strive after happiness. They want to become happy and to remain so. This endeavor has two sides, a positive and a negative aim. It aims, on the one hand, at an absence of pain and unpleasure, and, on the other, at the experiencing of strong feelings of pleasure. In its narrower sense, the word happiness only relates to the last. In conformity with this dichotomy in his aims, man's activity develops in two directions, according as it seeks to realize, in the main or even exclusively, the one or the other of these aims. As we see, what decides the purpose of life is simply the program of the pleasure principle. This principle dominates the operation of the mental apparatus from the start. There can be no doubt about its efficacy, and yet its program is at loggerheads with the whole world, with the macrocosm as much as with the microcosm. There is no possibility at all of its being carried through. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. What we call happiness in the strictest sense comes from the preferably sudden satisfaction of needs which have been dammed up to a high degree, and it is from its nature only possible as an episodic phenomenon. When any situation that is desired by the pleasure principle is prolonged, it only produces a feeling of mild contentment. We are so made that we can derive intense enjoyment only from a contrast and very little from a state of things. Goethe, indeed, warns us that nothing is harder to bear than a succession of fair days. Thus, our possibilities of happiness are already restricted by our constitution. Unhappiness is much less difficult to experience. We are threatened with suffering from three directions: from our own body, which is doomed to decay and dissolution, and which cannot even do without pain and anxiety as warning signals; from the external world, which may rage against us with overwhelming and merciless forces of destruction; and finally, from our relations to other men. The suffering which comes from this last source is perhaps more painful to us than any other. We tend to regard it as a kind of gratuitous addiction, although it cannot be any less fatefully inevitable than the suffering which comes from elsewhere. It is no wonder if, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness, just as the pleasure principle itself, indeed, under the influence of the external world, changed into the more modest reality principle. If a man thinks himself happy merely to have escaped unhappiness or to have survived his suffering, and if in general the task of avoiding suffering pushes that of obtaining pleasure into the background, reflection shows that the accomplishment of this task can be attempted along very different paths, and all these paths have been recommended by the various schools of worldly wisdom and put into practice by men. An unrestricted satisfaction of every need presents itself as the most enticing method of conducting one's life, but it means putting enjoyment before caution, and soon brings its own punishment. The other methods, in which avoidance of unpleasure is the main purpose, are differentiated according to the source of unpleasure to which their attention is chiefly turned. Some of these methods are extreme and some moderate. Some are one-sided, and some attack the problem simultaneously at several points. Against the suffering which may come upon one from human relationships, the readiest safeguard is voluntary isolation, keeping oneself aloof from other people. The happiness which can be achieved along this path is, as we see, the happiness of quietness. Against the dreaded external world, one can defend oneself by some kind of turning away from it, if one intends to solve the task by oneself. There is indeed another and better path, that of becoming a member of the human community, and, with the help of a technique guided by science, going over to the attack against nature and subjecting her to the human will. Then one is working with all for the good of all. But the most interesting methods of averting suffering are those which seek to influence our own organism. In the last analysis, all suffering is nothing else than sensation. It only exists insofar as we feel it, and we only feel it in consequence of certain ways in which our organism is regulated. The crudest, but also the most effective among these methods of influence, is the chemical one, intoxication. I do not think that anyone completely understands its mechanism, but it is a fact that there are foreign substances which, when present in the blood or tissues, directly cause us pleasurable sensations. And they also so alter the conditions governing our sensibility that we become incapable of receiving unpleasurable impulses. The two effects not only occur simultaneously, but seem to be intimately bound up with each other. But there must be substances in the chemistry of our own bodies which have similar effects, for we know at least one pathological state, mania, in which a condition similar to intoxication arises without the administration of any intoxicating drug. Besides this, our normal mental life exhibits oscillations between a comparatively easy liberation of pleasure and a comparatively difficult one, parallel with which there goes a diminished or an increased receptivity to unpleasure. It is greatly to be regretted that this toxic side of mental processes has so far escaped scientific examination. The service rendered by intoxicating media in the struggle for happiness and in keeping misery at a distance is so highly prized as a benefit that individuals and peoples alike have given them an established place in the economics of their libido. We owe to such media not merely the immediate yield of pleasure, but also a greatly desired degree of independence from the external world. For one knows that, with the help of this drowner of cares, one can at any time withdraw from the pressure of reality and find refuge in a world of one's own with better conditions of sensibility. As is well known, it is precisely this property of intoxicants which also determines their danger and their injuriousness. They are responsible in certain circumstances for the useless waste of a large quota of energy which might have been employed for the improvement of the human lot. The complicated structure of our mental apparatus admits, however, of a whole number of other influences. Just as a satisfaction of instinct spells happiness for us, so severe suffering is caused us if the external world lets us starve, if it refuses to sate our needs. One may therefore hope to be freed from a part of one's sufferings by influencing the instinctual impulses. This type of defense against suffering is no longer brought to bear on the sensory apparatus. It seeks to master the internal sources of our needs. The extreme form of this is brought about by killing off the instincts, as is prescribed by the worldly wisdom of the East and practiced by yoga. If it succeeds, then the subject has, it is true, given up all other activities as well. He has sacrificed his life, and by another path he has once more only achieved the happiness of quietness. We follow the same path when our aims are less extreme and we merely attempt to control our instinctual life. In that case, the controlling elements are the higher psychical agencies, which have subjected themselves to the reality principle. Here the aim of satisfaction is not by any means relinquished, but a certain amount of protection against suffering is secured, in that non-satisfaction is not so painfully felt in the case of instincts kept in dependence as in the case of uninhibited ones. As against this, there is an undeniable diminution in the potentialities of enjoyment. The feeling of happiness derived from the satisfaction of a wild instinctual impulse untamed by the ego is incomparably more intense than that derived from sating an instinct that has been tamed. The irresistibility of perverse instincts, and perhaps the attraction in general of forbidden things, finds an economic explanation here. Another technique for fending off suffering is the employment of the displacements of libido which our mental apparatus permits of, and through which its function gains so much in flexibility. The task here is that of shifting the instinctual aims in such a way that they cannot come up against frustration from the external world. In this, sublimation of the instincts lends its assistance. One gains the most if one can sufficiently heighten the yield of pleasure from the sources of psychical and intellectual work. When that is so, fate can do little against one. A satisfaction of this kind, such as an artist's joy in creating and giving his fantasies body, or a scientist's in solving problems or discovering truths, has a special quality which we shall certainly one day be able to characterize in metapsychological terms. At present we can only say figuratively that such satisfactions seem finer and higher. But their intensity is mild as compared with that derived from the sating of crude and primary instinctual impulses. It does not convulse our physical being. And the weak point of this method is that it is not applicable generally. It is accessible to only a few people. It presupposes the possession of special dispositions and gifts which are far from being common to any practical degree. And even to the few who do possess them, this method cannot give complete protection from suffering. It creates no impenetrable armor against the arrows of fortune, and it habitually fails when the source of suffering is a person's own body. When there is no special disposition in a person which imperatively prescribes what direction his interests in life shall take, the ordinary professional work that is open to everyone can play the part assigned to it by Voltaire's wise advice, to cultivate one's garden. It is not possible, within the limits of a short survey, to discuss adequately the significance of work for the economics of the libido. No other technique for the conduct of life attaches the individual so firmly to reality as laying emphasis on work. For his work at least gives him a secure place in a portion of reality, in the human community.